Hey, Brett.
Good evening, Rebecca.
Good to see you. I going through the Grow archives to work on this book. I've been really struck by the amount of material that was dedicated to the anti-nuclear work that you guys did beginning with Grow and going into the 90s, but really more concentrated in the late 70s and up until the mid 80s. And I just wondered, let's just start at the beginning, I guess. The I don't want to get too bogged down in all of it, but I do want to like put it in place in time and a little bit of history, how we got to be the nuclear dumping ground of the nation. So in 1950, the nuclear industry already had its sights set on South Carolina. And I'm sure that the reasons are complicated, but what do you account? Why was South Carolina so attractive?
Well, there was a war between the states in 1865 that really drew some lines that are indelible in this nation. And they're really predicated on race. And that a figure that had been the governor of South Carolina, he'd been a senator, he was a Supreme Court justice. Um, Jimmy Burns, or James F. Burns, uh, actually stepped down. He quit, retired from being a Supreme Court justice to serve as Roosevelt's you war management guy. He had his fingers on the money. James Burns did, and Burns was considered to be like the the second vice president because he had Roosevelt's ear. And then when Roosevelt died, and Truman became president, he had Truman's ear. And that Jimmy Burns was a stone cold racist. And that Jimmy had been, um, he, there was stuff that I studied and read, and people's opinion of that time and him was that he could have, should have been the vice president, could have been the president, but he wouldn't come off his segregationist attitude because he wanted to keep his creds in South Carolina. Now, that's all to set up the circumstance that at the end of World War II, which is 1945, the Manhattan Project had developed a nuclear bomb. And that there was, and now it's documented so well that I can speak empirically, that the question of using the bomb in the war was a burning issue, and that it wasn't until late in the war that it became available. And the scientists in the Manhattan Project were really against using it. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were against using it, and that the alternative was, if you've got to use it, drop it on an unoccupied island. Tell people watch that island disappear. That will make the point. The other argument for not using it was that Japan was the war was almost over. Japan was losing. You didn't need to do it. And Jimmy Burns insisted, because we had to do it to keep the communists in a box. And so this was the beginning of the Cold War. So there were whole arguments during that period of time that no country should own the bomb. It needed to be owned like by the League of Nations or the United Nations or some such consortium that couldn't decide to use it unless it was in the interest of humanity. Burns wanted to get around that because he wanted an enemy. It's so much easier to organize around fear and enemies than it is truth and justice. And that and so the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, right at the end of the war, set up the dynamic for there being a nuclear arms race and for America going to win it. And so fast forward a little bit, the war is over with, and that the discussions about developing nuclear weapons, who's going to make the stuff. And at that time, South Carolina had Mendel Rivers as a congressman, and there was a strong presence in Washington. Jimmy Burns was still making hay, and that the decision as to where to put the bomb plant devolved down to South Carolina because of our national politicians. And when it came to South Carolina, our state politicians was Edgar Brown and Solomon Blott, both from Barnwell. Blott was the Speaker of the House for 30-something years, and Brown was the President of the Senate. And so, of course, you're going to put it in Barnwell. Oh, and by the way, Thurman's from Aiken, which is right on the edge of the bomb plant. And so I've never actually seen one of the documents, knocked on doors and told people in two towns, a little town called Snelling and one called Dunbar, y'all gonna have to dig up your dead folks and move. Government needs your land. They took 312 square miles and moved a couple thousand people out of this area that became the Savannah River plant. And it produced America's nuclear weapons material. And that process began, the political process began in the late 40s. Strom Thurmond was a lawyer who was representing people suing the government for more money for their land. That's how he came kind of on the scene at that point. But that by 1950, 51, so the Savannah River plant becomes the largest employer in the state of South Carolina. However many years ago that was, I'd have to take my shoes off. It's still the largest single site employer in South Carolina, and they don't even make anything. And so it's jobs. It was a jobs plan. And that I had a meeting with Solomon Blott in his office, probably in the 70s when we're getting involved in the nuclear stuff, and asked him about the hazard posed by the bomb plant, et cetera. His response was, there weren't any brick houses before the bomb plant. Now everybody's got a brick house. And so it brought in jobs, it brought in money, and it was good for the economy. And nobody quite really cared if some people were going to die making the bomb, or that the bomb's ultimate use was something that really should be avoided. You're making something you hope you never use. And so that's kind of a prelude as to how it got here. And the anti-nuclear movement really goes back to the early times as the nuclear freeze, as the anti-nuclear weapons movement. This is before there was nuclear electricity, and that the Atomic Energy Commission regulated all things atomic. And they actually used the term the peaceful atom. And so it was to make people warm and fuzzy about nuclear weapons, was to say, oh, look, we can make electricity. And it was a bad idea then, it's a bad idea now for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that if you have something that no one else can have, you can set the price. So if you make your electricity not out of coal or oil or wind or sun, but of enriched uranium and plutonium, you got a monopoly. And so there was a move towards, by the corporations that made energy, a move towards nuclear power because it was the way they made the most money and controlled it. And so South Carolina was nuclear friendly, and we had, I think, 7 reactors in the state. And out of the, well, there's 78 commercial reactors. When the Virgil Summer plant outside of Columbia was built, it was the last reactor built, and I was the sole intervener in the licensing proceeding. But we get out of the chronological flow there. So back to the question of how the anti-nuclear movement became an issue with young anti-imperialists, anti-capitalist, environmentalists, all kind of people that believed Einstein's warning that all things have changed since the splitting of the atom, save man's wisdom, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe.
But I mean, just before we leave the Barnwell as a site thing, was it simply that they had big time politicians from that area that were trying to boost the economy there? That's obviously part of it, but was it also because it was a rural area that they didn't expect any pushback, or was it even considered a threat at that point? Like, was there any kind of nervousness? Did they, I mean, they didn't cite it outside of Columbia. Did they think that they'd get pushback if they did it somewhere else?
I think that there was an era when people believed that that actually, if it was good for the country, they would take, they would bite the bullet. They built two facilities, one in the Savannah area and one in Hanford, Washington. The one in Hanford is basically a desert, and the one in Savannah is basically in a swamp. It was really a bad location for it. But that there were people that were disposed or dispossessed that spoke out against it. And we actually stumbled onto an actual recording, and there was a famous sign that we have a picture of that was put up at the city limits of Ellington that said, "Why do they want to build a bomb to destroy towns that people live in that love their town as much as ours?" And that I think it was the New Ellington Singers that the National Archives have a copy of, and we had a copy of this song about our little town. And so, yeah, there was some complaints, but certainly no one was capable of standing up against something that had that type of momentum and money that this did. And people were scared the crap out of the nuclear weapons stuff. I mean, I am old enough to have hid under my desk in the 5th grade, duck and cover, because at any minute now, you're going to see a blinding flash, kids. Get under your desk. And so that there were any number of kind of tendencies pushing people towards acceptance.
So there was a period between I guess it took a while for SRS to get going, but even so, there was like a lag between a pushback of any kind. Was your thing at Barnwell in '78, was that the first public expression of note against the
Certainly
bomb?
a note. I mean, it was a very loud note.
I'm just saying,
If there were things before that and after what I just mentioned about when they were tearing the houses down and digging up graves and moving the towns, there were people that complained about that. And then Strom Thurmond got in there and sued the government, got people more money. But I'm unaware of anything other than some complaints from the dispossessed and the people that were working getting irradiated. There wasn't a public hue and cry about it, other than the anti-nuclear weapons movement that existed from right after they bombed Hiroshima. That movement was older people. Vietnam changed a lot of this stuff. Now we're talking about after Vietnam. And there were people like myself that I was going to be a political scientist or a politician, maybe a diplomat. And I decided the more I learned about American foreign policy, I can't represent this. And I'm just one of many people that early in their life, in their college days and early 20s, decided that I'll quote what we said back then: one side's right, and one side's wrong, and I'm on the side of the Viet Cong. The imperialism. We supported a colonial dictatorship in this country, and that was wrong. Those are the discussions I tried to have with my military father. But that we're coming into this time of post-Vietnam, post-civil rights, where you've got the civil rights warriors and the anti-Vietnam warriors that were looking at other manifestations of the tendencies that we dislike and decry, that we could point to people and say, look at this. This is an example of what we're talking about. That when your public policy is determined by private profit, you're going to pay. And so the public policy in South Carolina was being nuclear friendly at the great expense, in terms of nuclear weapons, of the world, certainly the workers that were making it. We typified the dangers of the bomb plant being the bomb that's dropped on the people that it's intended to defend. So there was that. And then the commercial nuclear industry was another example that was literally closer to home to people. You may not get a bomb dropped on you, but you may live downwind from a nuclear reactor. And that first protest in 1978 that we did followed the first large protest in Seabrook, New Hampshire in '77. And the people that were the organizers of that were people that I'd known from the anti-war movement. And so, yes, it's true that this radicals of a feather flock together, and that it wasn't that we were just looking for something to complain about. It's that we had another example of the brutal nature of free market capitalism. And that this was one that, again, that the commercial nuclear reactors, they built one 3.5 miles from the house I lived in. And so this became local issues that people could relate to, more than this kind of abstract, really scary thing about the Soviet Union, you know, dropping bombs on us. And so it was 78 that event happened at the Savannah River plant. And it was
How long had you been talking? Was this part of the meetings before Grow? Then you were, I know you were meeting with at Bob Gild's house and probably other places before Grow opened. Was that what you were talking about, or were you still on the?
No, we were like a left-wing discussion group. We were talking about foreign adventurism, racism at home, that type of stuff.
So it really was Seabrook kind of ignited the movement here.
When Ruth Thomas, in her late 50s, got engaged in the licensing proceedings for the Allied General Nuclear Services plutonium reprocessing facility on the edge of the bomb plant. The feds cut off this little piece and sold it to the 3 largest oil companies in the world. And so, again, remember I said that if you are into making money off of energy and you can get something nobody else has, you're going to make a whole lot of money. And so that direction of the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel that's used up and really dangerous, they called it, you know, reprocessing is a good thing. We can take this and use it again. But the process made more waste than it started with. And it was moving towards using plutonium as a fuel. The plutonium doesn't exist. And John Goffman, one of our keynote speakers at the original Barnwell activity, he spoke. And he was, he's attributed to be one of the people that was in the laboratory when they discovered plutonium. So he's the father of plutonium, came and spoke at our thing. And he said that the Savannah River plant poses the greatest risk to the United States security of anything he can think of. That you could have the explosion, some type of conventional weapons explosions at the Savannah River plant. And with weather conditions being appropriate, you'd have X number of hours to evacuate the entire East Coast. Millions and millions of people. And so that was pretty compelling. And that that licensing of that commercial facility was something that opened the door for intervention. The nuclear stuff was there. It was already there. They weren't having hearings, should we do this? It was there. And you're not going to convince necessarily the American government to disarm. I mean, people have been trying to do that for a long time. But this commercial facility had a process and all the kind of NEPA stuff, the National Environmental Pollution Act, and all that the great environmentalist Richard Nixon pushed through. That plant, Allied General Nuclear Services, had to go through a series of all kind of public input and whatnot. And Ruth Thomas, bless her heart, she would show up at these hearings with her cardboard boxes, and it'd be this flock of lawyers that she'd be arguing against. And that was when the hippies happened in Columbia, South Carolina. And the hippie haven was 221 Pickens Cooperative on the hill, Pickens Street Hill, up from the university, up from Blossom Street. And it started out as a restaurant, cafe facility. And there was a craft shop in the back. I worked in the red potato woodworking shop. And I was kind of like the political person in the thing. And that's when we started the Grow meetings. And I had spent, I think it was the better part of 72 and 3 or 71 and 2 in prison for protesting the war in Vietnam, and got out and came back to Columbia and said, I'll stay if I can find a wonderful place to live in for free, and did. And that that's when the GROW meeting started in the mid-70s as a house meeting. And we met at other places, but I remember meeting at Bob Giles' house. Bob had just graduated from the University of South Carolina as a law student. I would have been in Bob's law class if my path had been different, but I chose the more ethical path and went to prison. But the fact that we had all of these ingredients where they announced they're building a nuclear reactor, like I think it was around 78 in Jenkinsville, South Carolina. The house that I was living in, wonderful old farmhouse with 7 fireplaces that had been basically abandoned by the family. That it was 3.8 miles from ground zero. And so at the same time, we'd been protesting the nuclear weapons stuff in Barnwell, and the go back to the Allied General Nuclear Services facility because it had liabilities in terms of having to jump through hoops to get to operate. Also, Jimmy Carter was against it. And Jimmy Carter, you may remember, was a peanut farmer. He was also president of the United States. And at the time, we had VISTAs, Volunteers in Service to America, that was like referred to as the Domestic Peace Corps. And Jimmy Carter had made anti-Vietnam War people, veterans, the head of the Peace Corps. And John Lewis was the head of VISTA, who later became Congressman John Lewis from Atlanta. And we had a VISTA contract. GROW did. We were a VISTA, can't remember what they call us now, a VISTA sponsor. Started off with 10 people, ended up with 14. Everybody wanted to work with us. And we opened an office in Barnwell for a year and staffed it with Volunteers in Service to America, paid for by the federal government to shut down the federal government. So it was a wonderful, very democratic and wonderful time here in South Kakalaki. But that the Allied General Nuclear Services facility, the hearings that Ruth Thomas had done, there was no large organization doing it. There was no headquarters of it. It was just kind of happening out of that 221 Pickens cooperative.
But who was Ruth? I know she was like the mover shaker for a long time by herself. And then what I read that she got edged out because she was too intense and whatever.
Edged out because of what?
I don't know. I think it's complicated and I don't really want to go there. But I'm saying that I'm glad you're giving her the props that she deserves, in my opinion. But I'm just.
Well, there were big time organizations.
What I'm asking you is, like, did she have an organization? Because what I'd read is like this housewife shows up with the boxes of what, and did she have any kind of backing from other groups or organizations, either in or out of state?
The Natural Resources Defense Council. There were some national organizations that got involved in that. And Ruth, the way these federal proceedings are, you can be a real pain in the ass just by being persistent. And Ruth was persistent. And so she certainly deserves credit for throwing nails in the road. And that if she was edged out of anything, it was by the fact that the lawyers and the big national organizations got involved. But she's always has been somebody that was given, I think, sufficient.
But one of the things where you're talking about Barnwell and the bomb plant, and there's like Chem Nuclear and Agnes, and you've got all of these things. It's really complicated unless you're part of this organization to keep everything straight. And to me, just trying to get my arms around this thing, it's been really difficult, A, because it spans a lot of years, B, it's got a lot of players, a lot of different groups and organizations involved. And it's just really, can you just describe the Barnwell itself? It's not, when you said Barnwell 1 and 2, I want to get there, but just what are you talking about? How many facilities? What did that look like at the time and now?
Yeah, first imagine what 312 square miles looks like. It's a pretty big chunk. It's larger than many countries in the world. And that on one side of that, let me tell folks that aren't from around here that it was referred to, Savannah River Plant was its original name. And it was referred to locally as the bomb plant, which sounded like the boom plant, B-U-M plant. And so everybody called it the bomb plant. And so on one side of the bomb plant was Barnwell. in Allendale. On the other side of the bomb plant was Aiken. Aiken, much larger town. And so I can't remember how long the road that went through the bomb plant was, but you go in one side and come out the other, and there's signs, do not get out of your car, do not stop. If you have a breakdown, leave your windows up, somebody will come help you. And these creeks flowing through there, steaming. And they had, no, I can't remember now, a number of nuclear reactors at the bomb plant that were built with 1950s technology, which I don't know, maybe it's better than new technology. None of them have blown up yet, but clearly they had a lot of leaks, a lot of problems, a lot of environmental damage. And they had, last count, 38 million gallons of high-level nuclear waste that is a result of irradiating you run a reactor, if you're not looking for electricity, you run a reactor to get the uranium in it to fission and to up the level that you have U-235, 238, and all this explosive. And you also get some plutonium out of that. And then there's tritium that they need, which is a hydrogen atom, a whole different thing. But so they're running a facility down there that the nuclear generation didn't have anything to do with electricity. It had to do with the ultimate product. But the ultimate product had to be ground up and put through chemical baths to extract these materials. And it made a really nasty, deadly mess called high-level nuclear waste that would literally kill you if you stood next to it. So they didn't know what to do with it. They still don't know what to do with it, however many years later this is, 70 years later. But they have big tanks down there. They're million-gallon tanks. And there's 35 million gallons of this stuff still there that has to be continually aerated and stirred, or it could get hot, go critical, and go boom. And so it's a ticking bomb. It may not explode in our lifetimes, but it ain't gonna go away because there's a 250,000 half-life on some of this stuff, meaning in 250,000 years, half of it will still be here. And so we were talking about the bomb plant. So on one side of the bomb plant, they cut off some commercial facilities and sold some land to Chem Nuclear. And Chem Nuclear started in the 60s, is one of the few commercial nuclear waste places where plants could send their stuff, hospitals could send their used irradiated material that they use for their medical purposes. And they dug holes in the ground with a bulldozer, and they put the stuff in it, and they covered it up with dirt. And so that's Chem Nuclear, and it's set right on the edge of the road to Barnwell from the plant. If you came out of the plant to Barnwell. And that Chem Nuclear was one of the least managed places in terms of sanity and safety because it was low-level waste. Low-level waste, I mean, it wouldn't kill you immediately. And that we certainly had enough information that there were chemicals and irradiated materials leaking out beyond the plant. I personally met a dog with one extra leg that lives literally across the street from the plant. And I seen some comment about that, and they talked about two-headed turtles, and I saw a two-headed turtle down there. And he talked about his neighbor with a pig with too many legs. And I said, I'd like to see that. And they said, no, it doesn't edit. You can't see that one.
Good God.
But it was like this kind of immediate concern right there, adjacent to the thing, that was disturbing, and that it's still operating. The Chem Nuclear is still operating, and that a friend of mine and I went for a tour with the president of Chem Nuclear one time, and I had a Geiger counter in my backpack, and Alan Stalvey was the president. I'll put him in the street because he's been the government liaison person to the Hospital Association of South Carolina. Don't trust it. But somewhere along this tour, we're driving around these trenches, and the damn Geiger counter has an alarm in it that I didn't even know about, and the thing starts screaming. And Stalvey's saying, "What's that? What, you recording what we're saying?" And I'm beating on it, trying to get it shut up. But it was clearly a hazard, and the stories of people that work there they bring the stuff in trucks And then they have plywood underneath it to catch the leaks. And the guys take plywood home and build chicken houses with.
Mm.
And then they'd have irradiated tools that come in from a reactor, and something, yeah, that was a nice set of tools there. And they end up at the flea market. And so it's, when you talk about atomic leaks, you got leaks like that, like somebody using something to build a doghouse with. And so we had a presence down there that was certainly received well by a goodly number of people. I mean, we were there to try and protect the workers. We spent a year in Barnwell in advance of the 78 event. We had a no nukes is good nukes road show that had characters dressed up. There was Sonny the Solar Lion and Ruddy Kilowatt, Rick Beatty and Becci Hardy, who were legends in our time, and did stuff in schools, in the local schools, and had alternative energy fairs and exhibitions, and bonded with the farmers and the people that weren't making their money off the bomb plant. Rented an old building down there. There was a big old 2-story grocery store that had staff in. And that was the groundwork that laid several years of really significant protests at and around the bomb plant. And so you had Chem Nuclear on one side of the bomb plant and the Allied General Nuclear Services Facility on that side. And those are the only two commercially leased out, or I don't know whether they were sold or leased and all, but these were things they put on federal property and let the private industry make them. And so our first target was the reprocessing facility. And I mentioned why we did that was because it was had more vulnerability to attack than nuclear weapons. And we did big time. I had a press conference at the National Press Association in Washington, D.C. We issued summons for all the corporations that had investments and involvements in the plant. And of course, they didn't show, but the contractor of the plant at the time was DuPont de Nemours, who war was good business for them. They made explosives. And that being that it was a nuclear facility that was going to take nuclear used fuel from around the world. See, when we sell nuclear fuel, we take it back as like a deposit in return. We don't let you keep it because you make bombs out of it. We're going to bring it back, we're going to grind it up, and we're going to get the plutonium out of it, and we're going to use it again. And so historically, one of the defenses of nuclear weapons and nuclear power was that you can't marry the two, that you can't use a nuclear reactor like somebody might want to do in a country like Iran. You can't use your commercial nuclear reactor to make electricity to make bomb grade material. Or you can, but we don't want you to. We can do that. So we're going to take all this stuff back, grind it up, and we've got a whole new generation of fissile material that we can run reactors on and make bombs with. And so this is a global issue. And that we had it leading up to, I mentioned we had John Goffman, the fellow that was attributed to one of the discoverers of plutonium, Helen Caldicott, very famous pediatrician from Australia, who was speaking all over the world, monks from Japan, people that had been in Hiroshima, Green Party people from Germany, people from all over the world came to that event. And that we had 5,000 people in a soybean field in 1978 in South Carolina. We worked hard for that, worked a year, printed lots of stuff, had really clever graphics and cultural aspects to the theater and the music. Had help from people like Jackson Browne and Graham Nash, did concert for us, raised money. And so it became a cause celeb. It was anti-nuclear was cool. And so that's brings us up to 78 and doing stuff at the bomb plant. Got another question?
Yeah, I think that it's really impresses me as an organizer how serious and disciplined everybody was. I mean, there are boxes of material here that have meeting minutes and talking about your affinity groups. And I mean, it was a real serious operation that involved lots and lots of people and lots of time. And I'm a little bit jealous because in the years that I've been doing this stuff, we've never had that kind of energy and sustained um, focus on anything that I've seen in South Carolina anyway. And I'm just wondering, how do you account for that kind of, um, I don't even know how you quantify it, this sense of determination, um
I hear where you're
seriousness,
going.
and like, what was it? Just the times? I mean, let me just finish by saying I think the challenges of organizing around this are obvious because it's science. We don't really do science well in South Carolina. It's a huge, incredible lobby that you're up against. So they've got all the money and you're literally outgunned. Um, and then you've got the whole economic thing that the people in these communities are poor and desperate for this kind of um,
I,
you know,
I,
a financial opportunity. So, I mean, you've got all of that working against you, and yet you were able to sustain this campaign for years. And I'm just, as a, like, as a vice, it's yay, but I don't understand how it happened and why that kind of happened, can't happen now on any issue. It just seems like there's no cohesion, no traction like that had, even against really incredible odds.
okay, let me give you a substantive reason that affects a lot of things. That smart oppressors know how tight to turn the screw. That the Vietnam War was the first war where a lot of people were dying that was on television. It struck the hearts and minds of like a generation of people. They wanted to go die. Unfortunate for them. There was a draft, and they drafted middle class kids. And that was unfortunate for them. They created a generation of people that saw through their bull. They saw that it was deadly. And this, you know, we're also talking about the civil rights movement coming to some kind of fruition, the Black Power movement coming up. I mean, I was at meetings with Stokely Carmichael and Ralph Brown during those days, in the 60s, before the anti-nuclear movement. But those people that understood the abject corruption of the people that learned how to forge our planet's beauty into power, they will kill you and say sweet things in your ears. And so that generation was a driver for what we're talking about. But that generation also taught the people in power to stop the draft, not invade other countries, buy armies, pay dictators to have armies. And so that a lot of the pressure that people felt, I had 3 pre-induction physicals at Fort Jackson. They wanted me to go to Vietnam. And I already at that point knew that we were on the wrong side. I wasn't going to do it. So they did away with the kind of pressures that make people have to make big decisions. Are you for segregation? Keeping the Black people in their place? How about the Vietnamese people in their place and them commies? And so the them and the us's, that became much more apparent to those of us who literally had their lives on the line. And a lot of people lost their lives. So that's a difference, I think. And now that young people aren't challenged in a literally life-threatening fashion, or at least some kind of moral equivalent of a life-threatening fashion, to have values that they can feel that they can live by and stand for. And so I mean, that's a significant element, I think, as to why we can't get the momentum that we had then. We have to figure out how you do that. And I think that that's what we're working on now. It's creating what we call a community of shared values and recreating that type of circumstance that we had at GROW that built the Natural Guard, the Palmetto Alliance, and eventually the Progressive Network.
Well, while you're on that subject of organizing, it's really striking to me, unfortunately, that the anti-nuclear movement, at least in South Carolina, was overwhelmingly white. And I think that's ironic because obviously the people at greatest risk by the nuclear industry are poor and communities of color. So, I mean, how did I know that the heart and minds of folks involved, I know there was probably an effort to include them in out. There's some of that happened later on. I know that environmentalist Inc. and all of that. So it did eventually happen. But at the early days, it seemed like there was no buy-in from the Black community. And I find that really hard to explain.
Well, I think it's pretty prima facie that as a white middle class American who had the leisure of having a roof over my head and money to buy food with, I had time to worry about stuff. If you don't have a roof over your head, you don't have money to live on, you don't have time to mess with that stuff. And so you're dealing with the more immediate concerns about simply existing. And so today, the Black people in South Carolina making a fraction of what white people do. There's still tremendous disparities in every life quality thing, from education, healthcare, economics. And so that this another historical lesson is that people that are too busy scuffling to live don't have time to organize to fight. Now, I watched that in prison and I spent a little time in Texas Department of Corrections, which was an amazing place because they got the guys up before dawn, put them in little white uniforms, took them out in the field, and they worked them till dark. And when they came back into jail, they was too tired to raise hell. They went to sleep, got up and did it again. And so that's a course example of a circumstance where you have an underclass that you keep so under that they don't have time to fight back. Because there was an upwardly mobile track for Black people. Ike Williams. Ike Williams was Clyburn's #1 guy, ran Clyburn's operation for years and years and years. And he was terrible person. And he worked for the waste industries and the nuclear industry. He would go into Black communities and neutralize them for waste disposal and things like that. So you've got, you call them, it's what the Vichy French were when they cooperated with the Nazis. You've got people that see a path for their well-being and their economic well-being and they're upwardly mobile to work with the forces that are oppressing, that causing people to flee. So you've got the fleeing smart people and then some that stay that become the operatives, the important Black people, the ones that threw Majestica Simpkins out of an NAACP that she started because she was too aggressive and inhibited the ministers, the men's upwardly mobile opportunities to become somebody important. So it's a complicated sociological thing, but I think
it really is complicated, but I think it's really worth talking about and trying to understand so that we can not make the same mistakes again. But I want to take it back to Barnwell because I love the story of it. Just, it was a beautiful thing. And I can't imagine how much energy and inspiration that you all came away with from that day. Because, I mean, it not only was it a really impressive organizing effort that resulted in how many people showed up that the first thing. I don't think we've set it up right, and that's my fault. So Barnwell, how many people showed up, and it was over the course of a couple of days, right? And so you had
over 5,000 people there, and that if we told anybody that Jackson Browne was going to perform Saturday evening, or that there would have been 20,000 people because it was right at the top of his career, and we didn't tell anybody that Jackson was going to be on stage because we didn't want the headlines to be pop festival. And so that was noble. I'm not sure whether that was the right decision or not, but yeah, it was a huge number of people from all over the world, literally. And we had buses coming in from different states. Steve Gaskin's farm in Tennessee sent people down in advance to help build the trains and whatnot. And some of the colleges sent buses, and so it was quite the thing.
And it was well covered. That was the other thing that really struck me about it, that, CBS, all the major networks were there back when, like, You
The
know,
Rolling
we had
Stone.
newspapers, there was newspapers there, the Rolling Stone, Village Voice. And I just wanted to ask you about something I read just today in, I think it was Rolling Stone, Howard Cohn's piece about that first Barnwell thing. And in there, he talks about a little scene that after the bunch of people were arrested. I don't think you've said that part. A bunch of people got arrested. Like how
Yeah,
many?
280 people.
200 people, 80 people got arrested. And that after you made bail, that you came out and were stumbled upon the guy, they said the cop that, this is in the Rolling Stone, the cop that arrested you 10 years earlier was there and shook your hand, and that you spent 3 hours sitting on the cruiser after you made bail talking about nuclear power and why it was such a risk. And that at the end of that, this is Howard Cohn's reporting, that he shook hands with you and said, well, if all the things you're saying about nuclear power are true, then maybe I'll be with you at the next sit-in. And I just had to ask, what cop was that? And did he ever show up?
Yeah, that's the same one that was a military policeman when I was helping sneak people off the Fort Jackson to go to Canada in the 60s. And that he became a sled agent. And he later told me I was right about Vietnam, right about the nuclear power. And he's one that protected you and I at a demonstration when we put the banner up that put, I forgot, Dan Quayle, the Vice President Dan Quayle, who nobody remembers, that put one of Dan Quayle's illegal paramours next to lines.
What was his name?
Just as soon not say.
All right. So Barnwell 1 was
He pointed a gun at my head one time, said I'd rather take you back dead when he was arresting me. So yeah, he came around. I don't know, we got time to talk.
Did he ever show up at a demo with you?
What?
Never mind. He said he was going to show up. Never mind.
No, I don't think he ever showed up. I mean, he was still paid to be a cop. This is his day job.
So Barnwell 1 was a huge success, and then you did it about nearly a year later, did Barnwell 2. I'm just wondering, how was that different, and what do you remember about that?
Well, one of the things that is very remains with me is that the feds, they were rude. They wouldn't let us do what we wanted to do where we wanted to do it. And they had like changed rules and drew new lines and did all kind of stuff. But we did it anyway. And it was another really magnificent event. And that one of the things I tell people when we're doing something like this is that you're the main target. When you do civil disobedience, you are the main recipient of the value of that. And it really does. It changes people's lives. When they get a chance to stand up or sit in the road or do something and get drug off by the police, it's really something. And I just have some memories of some of the people. One guy that was in my affinity group was an 80-something-year-old church deacon from Greenville, South Carolina, who never had even a parking ticket in his life. And he said he didn't want to go up yonder unless he could make some kind of stand against this nuclear stuff. And the pictures of him being arrested with tears of joy running down his face were just really evocative of that point, that it changed him more than it did the bad people.
Wow, Brett, that's lovely. There's a lot I want to ask you, but it's getting late. Let's leave it here for now. I want to still talk to you more about VC Summer, and I mean, y'all were still doing organizing into the 80s. I wanted to talk to you about the SRP demonstration in 1982, where 6 upstarts were arrested. You want to just touch on that, or you want to do that later?
Let's do that later. I think that, well, we can finish the bone plant talk tonight by merely mentioning that the things we did, they got progressively smaller, but it was also progressively smaller nuclear weapons. I mean, during this, there are like treaties with the Soviet Union where we're destroying weapons. And we only have like enough to blow up the planet like 20 times instead of 200 times. But that the Savannah River plant has not been making weapons material. And that there still have 12 or 13,000 people employed down there. You wonder what they're doing. But that the pressure, it is worth holding up, that the pressure that the people put on the nuclear weapons facility had an effect, a positive effect. And that we'll talk about in our next installment. It's an exciting episode. The effect that we had on the commercial nuclear power development. And that that while they're driven in essence by the same kind of analysis, is certainly a different audience that you're looking at, because these were local. These were people like in your neighborhood. There's a reactor, and the nuclear weapon stuff was a kind of a more arcane, global, looming threat. But fortunately, that we're not making bombs like we used to, and that there's still arguments about the need to refresh the supply, but it's a shadow of its former self, other than the fact that the toxic waste is still done the work with it.
All right, Brett, let's leave it there for tonight. And I'll just leave it with, I really appreciate your service to this country.
Same as Rollins. I could do no less.
Yeah, you could.